Okay, hi everyone. Greetings.
Hello.
So we've got some options this evening to either look at how to write a POLS essay or to look at the tutorial that we did this week. Both will take around 40 minutes each. So we can either do one or the other or both. Any feelings on that? Then perhaps you could tell me. What do you feel is most appropriate?
I'm okay with both.
You're okay with doing both?
Yeah.
Sean and Caden, have either of you done the tutorial or the essay writing one?
I've not done either, so I'm cool with both too.
Okay. Caden?
Yeah, I don't mind either.
Okay, all right. Well, let's start with the how to write an essay one, and then morph into the other. What do we got here? Hey, Virginia, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. Maybe I'll try and do an abridged version of this. Okay, so Lucy and Virginia, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the essay writing thing first, and then we're going to work on, hi Jonathan, we're going to work on this week's tutorial as well. Have either of you guys done either of those tutorials? Virginia?
No, not the tutorials.
No, not the tutorials.
Okay, good. All right, we'll do that then. And I'll try and give you an abridged version of the first one, if I can, so we can spend more time on the origins of the Cold War. All right. So this is a tutorial I put together a couple of years ago because it became obvious after the first essays came through that that people didn't recognize that there was a difference between writing a POLS essay and in particular writing a history essay, but then again any other type of essay. The only one that I would say that I felt was close to a POLS essay and style is the philosophy essay, because the philosophers don't want any waffle. They want you to get straight to the point, tell them what your argument is, give the argument and get out. It's a great discipline to have, which is why you should think about doing philosophy if you get a chance. But the history essay, the POLS essay are quite different. And one of the reasons for that is because in POLS we like to use theories. So this is an example of how to write an essay, and then a little bit later on, how to incorporate theory into your essay. And I'm going to go through some of the essay questions. I won't do all of them for sake of time, but I'll try and concentrate on the ones that you're thinking about doing. So the first essay is due on the 12th of April, it's worth 20%, and the second essay is a month later, also worth 20%. And then you've got a 3-hour exam where you write an essay for each hour. That's worth 50%. The exam essays are usually marked a little bit easier because we know that firstly, you don't have the benefit of taking any books into the exam with you. So you can't do citations and references and things, and you can't get quotes perfect. But we are looking for some understanding in the exam. I think the thing you have to keep in mind when you're writing any essay, but particularly a POLS essay, is that we have an awful lot of essays to mark, and we do get worn out after marking 30 or 40 of them. And we start to forget which essay we're marking. I have got to the point myself where I've scrawled all over somebody's essay, you know, this is not the question, or you're not doing it right, or whatever. And then to my horror, look back and seen that I'm commenting about an essay I marked before this one. And they've all blurred into one. So think about the examiner and think about what you can do to make the examiner's life easy. The one thing you can say about an essay is that you can usually tell within the first few lines whether it's worth an A or not. You just get a sense of the fact that the writer has control over the essay. They know what they're doing. They're confident. They've thought it through. They're relaying it to you in a clear manner. And so what usually happens is after a couple of sentences, so you say, I think this essay is worth an A or an A plus even. And then you're starting to look through the rest of the essay to see whether you're confirming your first opinion that it's great, or whether it starts to slip halfway through or towards the end. So knowing that the examiners kind of prejudge your essay means that you should spend a lot of time on your introduction getting it right. Knowing that, hey David, knowing that the examiner is going to feel good about your essay right from the very beginning, and then keep feeling good all the way through it. So your introduction needs to start with something snappy. It's amazing, particularly at first year, how much trite first sentences you get. My favorite of all time is somebody who wrote something along the lines of, never in all my years have I seen anything as horrifying as the brutality of the Second World War. The problem is that people try to find quite definitive first sentences and trying to sort of stamp the mark on it, but they come out with terrible cliches. Never in the history of mankind, that sort of stuff. It's nonsense. And you get hundreds of them. So all the first sentences are not good. I'm suggesting something like a fact that bears upon your argument. You know, you might be talking about the origins of the Cold War, and you say something like, in 1942, Nazi Germany's propaganda machine revealed a horrifying fact: Russia had murdered 10,000 soldiers and buried them in Katia Forest. You know, it's a way of saying that that the mistrust of both sides was already taking place at the beginning, during the First Second World War. So try to find an interesting opening line. You've got to have a thesis statement. We're in the area of social science now, and social science is all about providing an argument, stating clearly what your argument is, proving your argument, and then concluding why your argument was right. So any introduction which says it could be this or could be that is going to get a bad mark. Any argument that says I am going to argue that such and such and such and such says to the examiner, this person's got control over their essay. And the thesis statement is quite something quite clear. So it's quite good to say something like, I'm going to use the lens of realism to explain why the Cold War was really a battle over resources, resources that would translate into power. You know, that kind of thing. It's quite clear what your argument is, and it's not just clear that you're going to use realism and that you've got some foggy understanding of what realism is or any of the other theories. Signposting. In the introduction, you need to lay out how you're going to use your argument. And it's, I always say that it's very similar to a courtroom drama. So those of you that know law will understand what I'm talking about. Guy gets up in front of the court and he says, members of the jury, today I'm going to prove that Mr. X could not have killed Mrs. Y. I'm going to show, first of all, that Mr. X didn't have any motivation to kill Mrs. Y. I will go on to show that Mr. X could not have killed her because he wasn't in the same city on the night of the murder. You know, this kind of stuff, right? It's called signposting. What it means is that I am in control of my argument. I'm going to take you through this in a logical way. It's going to be easy reading. There's nothing worse than not having signposting in an essay. So it's a slow reveal, you know? You have to wait for the last sentence of the essay before you know what the person's even arguing. And you get heavy marks against you for not doing that. Or I should say for doing it. So first I will show that B, then I will demonstrate C, then I will tackle D. And you're allowed to use language like I will do this, I will do that, I will do this. I will argue that. You're not allowed to use language that is in the area of opinion, which is a different thing entirely, where you say, I feel this, you know? It's my belief that. What you're saying is, I'm going to present you an argument and I'm going to do it in a clear and logical way. Again, like the lawyer getting up in front of the court. And then a summary at the end of the introduction where you say, I will illustrate, which will all illustrate my argument that the Cold War began because of a fight over material resources or whatever. Okay. So you're signaling to the examiner right in the first introduction that this is going to be a clear argument and that you're in control of the essay. What you always find is that when you get to the end of writing your essay, your argument has changed subtly. And often you forget that. You always got to go back at the end and look at your introduction and say, is it consistent with what I actually argued? Or has it changed along the way? Tidy it up. Main body of the essay, always start with strong comprehensive definitions of your key concepts. In an essay about the origins of the Cold War, you would need to define what theory you were going to use. And you need to define it absolutely clearly and tick off all the boxes that the theory expects. And it could be as much as a paragraph where you do that. Now, I know you've got a limited number of words in this, so you do have to learn to be concise, but there's a huge benefit in making sure your definitions are accurate and your definitions have lead on to your argument. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Again, people don't feel comfortable writing a paragraph that doesn't seem to be the argument. People feel that, you know, it seems illogical to stick it in there. And a lot of people like to wrap their definitions into their evidence. Realism is about this, and this is happening in this. You know, this realism is about fight over material resources, and the Soviets were busy pulling coal and steel and plant out of Germany after the war. It's not clean to do that because you're revealing the theory slowly as you're making your points. Oh, by the way, couple of paragraphs later, the realism is about anarchy, and so I would need to talk about anarchy too. Much cleaner to do it in a paragraph by itself. And again, like when you're at a conference and somebody says to you, okay, before the conference begins, I just need to do some housekeeping. The toilets are over there. In case of a fire, we all assemble out here. I just need to tell you about these things and then we'll start the conference. You do the same with your definitions. Before I begin with my argument, I just want to set a level playing field so we're all on the same page and tell you what my definitions are. You keep signposting throughout. So in the introduction, you've set up the way you're going to lay out your argument. So you say, okay, the first part of my argument is I'm going to show B, right? You write a paragraph about B. You say, okay, I also said in my introduction that I'm going to demonstrate C, right? So then you lay out C in a paragraph. Right? You cannot discuss this problem without also referencing D, so then you put D in your third paragraph. Again, you haven't got a lot of paragraphs, but if you're writing for an audience of a tired examiner who's already marked 30 or 40 essays and just buggered and wants to go to bed, what you're telling this person is, this is easy. You don't have to go back and say, what was it he was going to argue again, and check back at the beginning. You don't get lost and say, what is he arguing now? I can't keep up. So signposting throughout the essay is really important. Use at least 3 well-detailed examples to prove your point. 3 case studies or 3 major points is important in a short essay. But also, if you can, try to give 3 examples in a sentence, right? So in the case of the origins of the Cold War, you might say something like, the early warning signals that the Russians might end up being the adversary came in Iran after the war, when they wouldn't budge out of Iran. It came from Greece when there was trouble with the Bosphorus. It came when they discovered the Katia forest, and that's one sentence. And you've got 3 things there that say, bang, bang, bang. This is all good. I know what I'm doing here. I've got plenty of evidence to support my argument that the mistrust has been building. Yalta was an example. And it was on both sides. So the Russians were peeved with the Americans because they had taken so long to establish the second front. So they thought the Americans were deliberately delaying things so the Russians would bear the brunt of the German assault. And again, you haven't got a lot of words here, so you need to be quick. Now, just a side point, which is that when you've got 1,500 words to write, and you've got tons and tons of information, more than you can possibly fit into 750 words, and you're bursting at the seams to try and get it all in, there is a way to get it in, and that's footnotes, right? So it's very easy to say something like, example of mistrust was Tehran, Greece, and Katia forest, and then put a little footnote that says some other examples are this and this and this and this. And you do get points for that, because the researcher says, the examiner says, this person has put a lot of work into the research. They've got lots of additional evidence that they can't bring into the 1,500 word essay, but I can see that they've really thought this problem through, right? So I used to dump tons and tons of stuff into my footnotes to the point that I had half a page of footnotes, and I probably pissed off the examiner by being too keen, But there's a nice happy medium where you show off a bit that you've done the work, and the examiner acknowledges that you've put in about 10% more work than anybody else has, and that you deserve a couple of extra points for it. Towards the end of the main body of the essay, again, you're a good social scientist, so there's an expectation that you'll have a balanced view. You don't just put up your argument and go home. You say, I've argued from a realist point of view, but now I want to just briefly tell you what a alternative explanation would be, and showing you what the liberal explanation would be and what the constructivist explanation would be. You haven't got a lot of room, so it's like a debate. You don't give away too much detail about your opponent's argument. You just acknowledge that the opponent has an argument and it's not a very strong one. There's nothing wrong with you saying that the liberal perspective on the origins of the Cold War, the constructive, has merit. If you think it's a good argument, there's nothing wrong with saying that. But what you're trying to say is that the reason why I've chosen realism, or whatever the equivalent is because I think this is the best argument. This is the argument that I think is going to give me an A+. So you say, I can see some merit in the liberal argument, but it's not as good because of this, because I can see that material resources is what it's all about. Material resources in order to achieve security is really the defining cause of the conflict between the US and USSR. And I agree that, the fact that they weren't trading together or something like that, the fact that they really weren't getting on in the United Nations and couldn't agree to a set of rules, or the fact that there was an authoritarian regime in USSR that that would always come into conflict with democratic regimes. I agree with that explanation, but I still feel that it was a security issue for both of these powers. They were both scared of each other, and they were both grabbing resources in a zero-sum game because that was what was driving it. So try to get through that alternative explanations paragraph very quickly. I don't think you should be writing more than about 2 sentences per theory. 1 sentence to set up what the theory expects. Liberal theory expects things to be focused around regime type, democracy promotion, democracy, free trade, and rules. And then you could put a little side note explaining that in a bit more detail if you feel that that's a little bit inadequate. A little footnote, I should say. And then I don't think this is as strong because I don't really see that that the ideology thing was such a big deal. If the Soviets were quite happy to get into bed with the Nazis and the Nazi-Soviet aggression pact over Poland. So when did the ideology really play a major part in that? That kind of thing. Okay, the summary is the thing that people usually do the worst. And there's a very good reason for that, which people are sick of writing and they want to finish the thing, right? But you always get the feeling that the summary is the rushed part, where it's like, I just got to quickly tie this up and I can go to bed. And to be quite honest with you, that's one of the things that indicates to the examiner that this was rushed and it was done on Sunday night when it had to be handed in on Monday morning, because there's no thought gone into it. And often the summary doesn't even cover the points that you've made. I argue that the summary is probably the most important bit, because if you've started off with a terrific introduction and the examiner said, I think this is an A or an A+ essay, and he's looking at reasons not to give you an A+ throughout the thing, if he gets to the summary and it's weak, he's going to say, no, actually, I just think that's an A, or maybe actually the whole thing fell to pieces and it's really just a B+. It's a 78%. They're almost sitting on an A, but it's not that good. So you can undo all of your hard work by writing a shit summary. So don't do it. Really use the summary to score points and say, I came in here telling you I was going to argue this. Then I demonstrated that my argument was a good one by raising these points. I looked at the alternative explanations of the other theories and they're just not as strong. And basically what you're saying in your summary is, give me that bloody A because I deserve it. Right? Don't throw away your chances. So craft your summary, make sure it's absolutely perfect and you're happy with it, and then go back and look at your introduction and make sure the 2 things match. A good essay really is edited over and over again until you're absolutely happy with it. And you can tell, again, somebody that's rushed it because it's got spelling mistakes and things in it. And the examiner groans and says, I really wanted to give that guy an A+, but honestly, the typos are all the way through it. The whole thing looks really, really unprofessional. I can't, in my heart of hearts, give this guy an A+ because he's let himself down. So print the essay out when you're finished with it. Much easier to spot typos when it's printed out in front of you. And give it to somebody else to read, even if it's your mum and she hasn't, or your dad, and they have no idea what the origins of the Cold War are. They can still read the thing for sense. They can still say, I didn't understand what the hell you were talking about in that sentence. It's just gobbledygook. You go back and say, well, actually, you're right. It wasn't as clear as I could have made it. And they can still point out typos that you're just not going to spot. I worked in advertising for 25 years, and there was a famous example of an ad agency that took out a full page in the New Zealand Herald, and it cost an enormous amount of money. And they spelt their name wrong in the headline of the ad. Nobody saw it because nobody was looking for their name to be spelt wrong. And you do those stupid things, and you look at something over and over and over again, and never see the mistake. I know another guy who wrote about for his PhD, and only spotted the mistake in the last couple of seconds before he submitted it, where he talked about Obama bin Laden. You know, he'd had that PhD sitting in front of him for 3 years, and he hadn't spotted Obama bin Laden in it, never saw it, not to the last second. So give the thing to somebody else to read. It's worth it because it might pick you up. It might just take you over an A into an A+. Citations and referencing are absolutely mandatory for most POLS essays, unless you're writing about one particular article in which you don't need to cite it necessarily because everybody knows you're only talking about that particular article. And usually you'll get clear instructions even then on what kind of citations you're going to do for that. A bad bibliography loses points. You're expected to use a particular style, whether it's Harvard or APA or Chicago or whatever. Usually we don't care too much in politics so long as you're consistent with it. But if it's scrappy or you've got bad sources in it, the examiner picks it up right away. And there are examiners, particularly tutors that haven't been tutoring for very long and aren't really very comfortable with the subject matter, who will dock you points because you've got bad referencing. I don't do it. I kind of figure it's forgivable, so long as it's not a dog's breakfast. But I've seen examiners that have given people the C+ because you know, they've got spelling mistakes, they've got citation problems, their bibliography is incomplete, and they figure that's not a professional job. Usually when an examiner does something like that, a tutor does something like that, and you think you've written a good essay, in fact, always when you think you've written a good essay and you think you've been badly served by your tutor, you do have the right of redress. And the smart students, usually the law students, are the ones that come to us and say, can you mark my essay again because I don't think I deserved a A, I think I deserved an A+. And it's not stupid to take advantage of the fact that when we have to remark an essay, most times we will give it 1 or 2 points more. If you're sitting on a 74, a B, and you sort of think, I deserved an A for that, you know, we might look at it and say, oh, you don't really deserve an A for it, but how about we give you a 75 or a 76 and we bump it up to a B+, you know? So don't be afraid of challenging your mark and giving it. I can't think of a single example where somebody challenged their mark and they slipped back a mark or 2 or more. That never happens. We start from the assumption that the mark you got was either fair or it was unfair. But we don't start from the assumption that we might say, well, actually, we think that the tutor was too generous. That never happens. So you've got everything to gain by taking your essay if you're not happy with it and saying, I'd like a little bit more. Obviously, if you've got an A or you've got an A plus, and you say, I really wanted a 98% or a 99%, you've got a dog show of getting any more out of it. But for those ones that you figure, you know, shit, that was borderline and I deserved a bit more, give it a go. I'm just going to check to see what that chat is because I hadn't only just noticed it. Oh, Raka's gone. Okay. Okay. Yeah, and just another point is that if you found some little gem in your research that that your professor's never seen before, he's going to be thrilled with you and give you a mark for it. But if you don't cite it properly, he's not going to be thrilled with you, he's going to be angry. Particularly true if you say something like you quote somebody that the professor knows or the tutor knows really well, and you don't cite a page. And the tutor says, well, look, you know, I know John Mearsheimer's work really well, and I don't think he ever said that. And I can't find, you haven't given me the page and I'm going to go and check it. So I think you've got it wrong. I think you've mucked that up. Well, you've done yourself a disservice if John Mearsheimer did say it. And you haven't, sorry. That noise is my cat trying to bang the door down. I can't do anything about it. Just wait. I need to get myself a new computer. Okay. Let's look at the essay questions we've got. What is distinctive about the study of international relations? How does the study differ from other academic disciplines? Is anybody planning to do that question? No. To what extent was the bipolar international order a major departure from other past international systems? Is anybody thinking about doing that question? No. Would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm for interpreting international relations? What are the strengths and weaknesses of realism as a theory of international relations? Anybody planning to do that question?
I'm doing that question.
Yeah.
Good. So two of you, Sean and David, right?
In me,
And
Virginia.
Virginia, great. Okay, good. We'll have a look at that question in a minute. Is it
And
true
I
that,
did that one as well.
okay, is it true that the Cold War began after the Berlin blockade crisis of 1948? Is anybody thinking about doing that question? No. Okay.
To be fair, Peter, I'm actually not sure which one I'm going to do, so I'm still up in the
3
air.
or 4?
I'm thinking possibly 3 or 2, but I'm not decided yet.
Well, my personal feeling is that 2 is a disaster question, and I don't see many people getting good marks on it. I've been tutoring this for 4 or 5 years now, and I'd say from past experience, most people botch that question up. It's just not, there's not a lot of meat to the answer. Robert teaches it in a really unusual way. He talks about the multipolar world and then the transitional world or something like that. And then the bipolar one. I don't know if he teaches unipolarity because I don't think he believes much in it. And other than mouth what was in the second lecture or whatever it was, people have got nothing to say about that question. The best place to say it would be to go to Kenneth Waltz and do some reading on what Kenneth Waltz says about polarity. And he's got some terrific things to say, but that's a more advanced essay. And one or two people have done it and done it well, but using what you've learned from Robert, it's a pretty inadequate essay. For me, number 3 and number 4 are the two ones to win high marks on, because you've got a lot you can say. So let's look at number 3 first, and then quickly look at number 4 in terms of the other tutorial, because that's what we were doing in the other tutorial. So just looking at the lectures, lecture 1 was about what is IR, defining it, what is distinctive about it, the major actors. So that pertains to question 1. Lecture 2 was international systems, and there's those types of types of polarity that that Robert talks about. Again, I'm not comfortable that there's enough in it for a good essay. Lecture 3, he talks about idealism, realism, social constructivism. Lecture 4, the origins of the Cold War, and lecture 5, the Berlin crisis. So the last two are the last question, and the lecture 3 is the one about is it the best paradigm? Okay. So when you look at an exam, an essay question, you have to really interrogate what is he asking you to do. Take the exam question apart bit by bit, and then make sure that you're delivering on all of those bits. So the question is, would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm for interpreting international relations? What are the strengths and weaknesses of realism as a theory of international relations? So you might want to decide that you need to define what international relations is at the beginning. You probably definitely need to define what a theory is. You want to do those things pretty quickly. And then you need to define what realism is. Is it one theory? Does anybody know the answer to that question?
There's different branches of realism. You could argue for an overarching theory of realism.
Excellent. So Sean's right there. You would acknowledge the fact that realism isn't really just one thing. It's a number of things. Sean, can you give me some examples of the different branches?
Yeah, there's classical realism, structural realism, and neo-structural realism, or neoclassical realism even?
Yeah, exactly. So probably leave neoclassical out of it, because it's a messy theory that even the structural realists don't like. Can you give me another name for structural realism? Anybody else? So structural realism is also known as neo-realism. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. There's also two sub-branches of structural realism. One is called offensive and one is called defensive. And you're not expected to know about those theories until year 2. But many students pull that out of the bag, particularly when they're talking about the origins of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. And once you start getting into that area successfully, it gets really hard to not award it an A, because the examiner's impressed with your level of knowledge about the theory and the ability to use it. So, as Sean says, you need to acknowledge that realism is not one theory, it's and has a number of branches. And you also need to put it into context and say, what are the other theories? You might not do that until, as I said, the end, where you put your case, first of all, for why realism is the most convincing paradigm. And then at the end of it, you'd say, well, what would the alternatives be to realism, and why are they not as convincing as realism? It's your penultimate paragraph. I'm very wary of people who give you a history of the theory, particularly those who say realism is Thucydides and Machiavelli and Hobbes. And I know that Robert covers it in the lecture, and there's a certain amount of truth to it. But really, realism takes off after the Second World War with classical realism and Hans Morgenthau. And by 1979, that's worn itself out mostly. And Waltz comes in with structural realism as being a much cleaner, mechanical, scientific theory, more like physics. So bringing up Thucydides and Hobbes does nothing for your argument. And I'll tell you for why. Because the question is asking you, would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm? So Robert's clearly asking you something by including the word remains. He could have easily said, would you agree that realism is the most convincing paradigm? But he's changed to say it remains. So what does he mean by that? Anybody got any thoughts?
That it used to be the most, like, it used to always be the most convincing, but now there might be other ones which fit better.
Exactly. Absolute. So what happens is realism is born out of the Second World War. It's a theory that you're being used to explain what happened in the Second World War. But even as it's being born, the Cold War has begun, and it becomes the paradigm that explains the Cold War beautifully. You've got two superpowers who are battling it out to the end, and both are terrified of each other. Both are, they believe it's a fight of survival. And it's pronounced because of the atomic bomb. And they both have the atomic bomb. And at any moment, they could blow each other up into smithereens. So realism becomes the paradigm in all of the universities throughout the Cold War, and particularly the major American universities, where if you're not a realist, you're nothing. You know, it's the flavor of the month. And then when the Cold War ends so abruptly, and as Robert says, realism failed to account or predict the end of the Cold War as it happened, it falls out of favor. And it falls out of favor at the same time that peace comes to the world, and we need theories to explain peace. So you have the rise of what they call neoliberalism, which is people like Joseph Nye, Daniel Kahane, Michael Doyle, Bruce Russett, who are all people that have been sitting in classrooms for 10, 15 years, listening to their realist professors go on and on and on about realism. And they're saying, well, realism isn't explaining what's happening in the world. So neoliberalism seeks to explain through democratic peace theory, through economic interdependence theory, and through liberal institutional theory, that the liberal perception of the world as being a place where peace can happen through democracy spreading through the world, through states trading together in such a way that they're linked and won't break those links for war because it would be too expensive, through states that agree to sets of rules through institutions that they'll all abide by, even big states will abide by. And that seems to be a really good explanation of the kind of peace that we're seeing after the Cold War, where globalization is spreading and prosperity is happening, and there's no more threat of major great power wars. The problem is that at the same time as neoliberalism starts to take hold in the universities as being the flavor of the month, we start to see small wars happening all across the planet. Civil wars seem to be breaking out. Wars of religion seem to be breaking out. Wars of tribe against tribe. Again, small wars, not great power wars, but wars of identity. And that's the time when constructivism takes foot. Because for some reason, identity seems to be a really good explanation for why states and non-state actors seem to still pursue conflict. We're not talking great power conflict. We're not talking big states like the US and the USSR at each other's throats anymore. We're talking about little things where people, old enmities that are thousands of years old suddenly bubble to the surface. The Sunni and the Shiites are at each other's throats. So constructivism now becomes flavor of the moment. And it's true that in most universities in the world now, you have whole departments of constructivists and no realists and maybe one or two liberals, because constructivism is the sexy theory that everybody likes. It's slightly more intellectually appealing because it's based on some French philosophy. It's got a bit of sexiness to it. And with the exception of only a few universities in the States, most notably University of Chicago, where John Mearsheimer is, and the University of Columbia in New York, where Richard Betts and Robert Jervis are. There are very few, or maybe Harvard, where Stephen Walters. There are very few realists left, and the liberal ones are people like Joseph Nye at Harvard, Robert Kahane, I think. Don't know where Robert is, but the rest of them are constructivists. So when Robert's asking you the question, would you agree that realism remains the most convincing paradigm? A, Robert is a liberal and doesn't like the realists. And B, he's saying, why on earth would it remain convincing when for the last 40 years it hasn't been? So if you're going to build an argument saying that it remains the most convincing paradigm, you've got to have some pretty bloody good evidence. It's not going to be Thucydides or Machiavelli that's that evidence. So who could tell me what kind of evidence you would put forward that would say that realism is back?
One of the arguments that I was considering using, which perhaps is a bit inflammatory next to what you said, is using the Millennium Dialogue and using that in an allegory type of way to then look at the South China Sea.
Ah, you got it.
And the way that the UN
I've spent
has
quite a bit of time comparing the Millennium Dialogue with the South China Sea. But the South China Sea is a terrific example. Why is the South China Sea an example of realism?
Essentially, the idea that much is right. China doesn't claim sovereignty over the entire sea, but has an illegitimate claim, which has been enforced by the UN, but the UN hasn't been able to show any muscle because of China's growing dominance.
First, your point you're making is that big countries get to call the shots.
Essentially.
Yeah. Second point you're making is, and a realist would make about South China Sea, is that it's in China's interests to secure the South China Seas for itself, because zero-sum thinking, if it's theirs, it's not somebody else's. What are the things that are in the South China Sea that China wants?
That's why I was linking it to the Millennium Dialogue, because it's of they claim that it's of military significance for having airstrips on the Atoll Islands, and also trade links, I believe.
Yeah, so the first thing that China wants is to make sure that its sea routes are preserved. They're worried that, that the US perceives their rise as being a threat, and that the US might try to contain them in some way, like they tried to contain the USSR. Second reason why China wants the South China Seas is because there's a lot of fish in the South China Sea, and they want to make sure that they've got the first dibs on it. And another reason why they want the South China Sea is because there's a lot of oil in the South China Sea, and they want to get their dibs on that. So the 9-dash line that they've drawn, which ropes in most of the South China Sea, is a territorial claim, no different to grabbing land. And it's a grabbing of resources, and it's grabbing of security, in so much as food and fuel security are important to the prosperity of China. If they lose it, they may not be able to feed their people, they may not be able to fuel their factories or their cars or their trucks or whatever, the ships. And if the sea routes are cut off from them, their exporting might is hugely undermined. So a realist interpretation, and particularly a neo-realist interpretation, would be that there is no world government. States are worried about their own security first and foremost, and they will self-help in order to achieve their security. They'll grab what they can. They'll prioritize their interests over other countries' interests. And that they'll start to think in terms of what material resources can I get that will make me safe, help me build up my economy so I can pay a big army, and zero-sum thinking, which is that if I don't have it, somebody else gets it. If I have it, they don't get it. So there's a lot of arguments there for a realist conception of the South China Seas. Are there any other examples in contemporary politics of realism seeming to be a better explanation?
The Syrian war also.
The Syrian war?
Yeah.
Okay, so where would you go on that one?
Well, I guess you could actually argue perhaps that's more socially constructed. I don't know, I guess that's a little bit more hazy.
Park the social constructivism, we can come back to that. Why realism?
Yeah. Why realism in that sense? I guess for the idea of hegemony, for America to go in there and maintain a democratic state, and
No, keep democracy out of it. That's liberalism.
Okay, true.
Who's the other major player in the Syrian war?
Both Russia and China are funding. Right.
Not so much China. China's trying to keep out of it, but Russia definitely.
Sure.
So you've got a return to great power politics where they're using proxy warfare like they did in Vietnam and Korea to play out what is basically a competition between the US and the Russians.
Right.
So yes, there's definitely an argument for Syria. Any other ones?
The Saudi invasion of Yemen.
Good. Explain how that works.
So basically, Saudi just has the interest of, I don't actually know completely everything about it, but I'm pretty sure it's Saudi Arabia invading Yemen because of the Houthi rebels that they claim that are in conflict with them. Yeah, I don't know enough about it. Sorry.
So that's good. No, I like it. Start from the basic precept. Is it a security problem?
Saudi Arabia thinks it to be so.
Good. Okay. Well, then it's realism, right? So Saudi Arabia is pursuing its own interests by getting itself involved in a civil war in Yemen, because it sees that if Yemen melts down or goes the wrong way, then Saudi interests will be diminished, right? And who else is involved in an indirect way in the Yemen war?
The United States, right?
Exactly. So the United States is supporting its ally Saudi Arabia with weapons.
And
So
then
you
is it
might-
Iran on the other side?
Yeah, I think you might be right. Yeah. So so you again a kind of great power politics thing, at least to some extent. What about another one that's a little bit higher up and more on the European end? About the same longitude, but not the same, but higher up.
That's
The
pretty
Right.
Ukraine.
Yes,
Ukraine.
yes, Crimea and Ukraine, right? When was the last time any major country invaded another one, annexed part of its land, and started a small war inside of it in order to assert its own interests? You know, it's a major international law issue that Russia just went in there and said, we're taking Crimea, bugger you, right? Return of Russia to great power politics. And why is Russia worried about Crimea? Is it a security problem?
It's their only warm water port.
Yes, you bet your ass it's a security problem. They see the encroachment of the United Nations, sorry, not the United, but of NATO and the EU. They see that losing Ukraine, if they lose Sevastopol, their own warm water port, which they've leased off Ukraine, they're in deep trouble in terms of a defense point of view. If they lose Ukraine to the EU and NATO, they've got an enemy right at their doorstep. They want to create some sort of a buffer zone like they did with Soviet Russia, where they have friendly neighbors, satellite states all around them. They've got Belarus. They don't have the Baltic states. The Baltic states dead against them. They're trying to push out and trying to increase their security by having these states around them that are friends of theirs. And if they're not going to be friends, they'll start little wars in them. So the point I'm making is that somewhere around 2008, where China starts to rise and get aggressive and start thinking about building islands in the South China Sea, somewhere around 2014, where Russia starts to first get involved in the Ukraine and take Crimea off them, and then in Syria, almost following up. And even things like Russia getting involved in the American elections are all examples of great powers who are worried about their security, starting to think about pushing back against, in this case, against the United States. And now you've got examples of Russia and China starting to form at least informal military alliances, if not getting closer to formal ones, against the US. So there's a sea change around 2008 to 2014 where great power politics returns. The world becomes a more dangerous place again. And the danger is not coming from wars of identity with small tribes and religions so much as you even see to some extent a decrease in world terrorism. We don't have Al-Qaeda as a major threat. We don't, even ISIS is starting to diminish in size and threaten. What you're seeing instead is this big countries fighting big countries, or at least getting into sort of semi-cold wars with each other. So if you're saying, does realism remain the most convincing paradigm? Well, you got an argument that around 2008, 2014, it becomes a convincing paradigm again. You know? So there are issues, obviously, about the world where realism might not be doing such a good job. Can you think of any? And again, I'm talking about stuff that's happened in the last year or two.
The example which came to mind, but
Yep.
far from the past year, was the Montreal Protocol because of the
Was what, sorry?
the Montreal Protocol and the way that that reduced CFCs, and that
Okay,
being the like
about that.
grandest example of cooperation.
Ah, right. Okay. So what you're feeding into is Robert's belief that there are issues that are borderless issues that everybody faces together, where we need to cooperate and we don't want to be pursuing selfish state interests. Right. So you've got climate change as an example of that. You know, we don't want. We need to cooperate as the world to solve climate change. Fixing it in one country is not the answer. Right? Brexit's another example of a phenomenon which you could put a realist spin on it, but that seems to be an identity problem. You know, the Brits didn't see themselves as Europeans and wanted to go off and become Brits again. So constructivism does quite a good job explaining why Brexit happened. What about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic? Is there a realist slant on the COVID pandemic?
I would suggest, I think just recently the European Union said that they would slow down the exporting the vaccine to other countries because they're having issues with their vaccine distribution.
Yep, that's a very good example. Vaccine nationalism, that states prioritize their own needs first and then they might share after their needs are served. What about any other examples where realism might prove to be working in the COVID pandemic? What was the first thing that states did when faced with the pandemic?
They shut their borders, or at least New Zealanders. That's not cooperative.
Yeah, where possible, they shut their borders and they started to focus on their own concerns and not the concerns of their neighbours. Right? It was every man for himself for there for a while, in many cases. And as Caden says, that translates also to the idea that the vaccines, we get what we want, because if we give them to everybody, they won't go around. We won't get enough of them. So there is an argument for realism in the pandemic. There's not such a good one I can't think of in terms of Brexit. There is an argument that says that realism, as horrible as it sounds, that states are not looking at climate change as being something they have to cooperate with. They are looking at climate change as something that is up to them to not fix, but to avoid. So there are countries that are still pumping out enormous amounts of carbon dioxide emissions and keeping their factories going at amazing speed on the basis that, well, we can't afford to lose our economy just because you guys want us to slow down. So again, self-interest in terms of not wrecking the economy rather than doing something about it and cooperating could be a realist argument. So you can see that question you can get a lot of meat out of it. You can get quite a great essay out of that question. And then when you go into strengths and weaknesses, the ones that Robert talks about are the failure of realism to anticipate the end of the Cold War, which is a bit historical now. The fact of the matter is that the realists were caught on the hop when the Cold War ended. Most realists would have expected it would have been a fight till the bitter end. One would have come out champion, the other one would have come out annihilated. But the defensive realists, who we talked about briefly a few minutes ago, argue that states will cooperate over security concerns. That states, the best example of cooperation over security concerns is military alliances, like NATO. states will always say it's better that we get together and fight this problem together, whether it's Nazi Germany or Bonaparte or Soviet Russia, than try to do it alone. So defensive realism say that states always believe that an aggressive state needs to be balanced against, that we need to form coalitions to balance out that power. If there's a very big state, then a whole lot of small states and medium-sized states and slightly bigger states will get together and form a coalition against it. And again, you saw that with Napoleon, with England, Russia, and Germany, and Austria all getting together to fight Bonaparte. You see that in the Second World War with Russia, France, well, not so much France, Russia, England, United States, also in the First World War, balancing against Germany. And you see that in the Soviet Union with all of the NATO countries getting together to balance against us. So the defensive realists believe that any aggressive state will be punished by the international system for being aggressive. And aggression doesn't pay. It's not worth trying it on because they'll gang up against you. And what you see with the end of the Cold War, and the way the realists explain it, is that the USSR was spending so much money, I think it was something like 30% of its GDP on military arms, and particularly nuclear arms, that the rest of the economy was suffering completely, and people weren't getting food and they weren't getting clothing, and the kind of products that they were making were all inferior and fell apart. And at some point, the Soviet Union just said, this is crazy. Pursuing a goal of trying to go to war, even in a Cold War, with the USA and the West is killing us economically. We're being punished for trying to be aggressive or trying to balance against the United States. It would be a whole lot better for us to give it up and find a cooperative solution that gets us out of this economic mess. So that's the way that realists, somewhat retrospectively, but pretty quickly, like within about 3 years of the end of the Soviet Union, go in there and explain from a defensive realist perspective that the Soviet Union just decided it's better to cooperate for our security than to go it alone against the West. So there is a kind of an explanation there that makes some sense, that dismisses the idea that this realists didn't have anything in their arsenal to argue why the Cold War came to a peaceful end. And then the realists don't like non-state actors. They're only interested really in the great powers. And yes, that is a disadvantage. It was a disadvantage during the Cold War. The post-Cold War, when we had other things that the other theories explained much better, like wars of identity. But the realists just shrug their shoulders and say, well, I'm sorry, but the big countries are the ones that have the most influence on the world. It's the big countries that tend to create the recessions, like the US did in 2008. It's the big countries that tend to start the wars, or at least accelerate the wars in a way that pulls everybody in. And it's worth studying the big powers because they have the most effect on the world system. And if we're not studying other things, like the third world, like things that are outside of the Western sphere, yes, you can level that criticism against us, but we don't think they're the things that ultimately matter as much as the big states coming to, big fights with each other. And that's purely a perspective thing. If you're interested in international relations and you say great power competition is simply not international relations, it's only a small part of it, or you're interested in solving the world's problems like climate change and you say, well, great power competition, sure, I don't mind studying that, but really what we ought to be doing is cooperating. Or you're a Marxist and you say that the problem is the struggle between the rich and the poor, the rich keep stomping all over the poor, and that's the big issue in the world, then yes, realism is not enough. But if you say the other way around, you're saying, well, look what's going on in the world right now, and all the problems, a lot of the problems in the world are coming from great powers simply pursuing their own interests, then yes, realism's got a lot to say. So that's for you to decide when you do the essay. Is everybody more or less happy with that one?
Yep.
Okay. Let's look very quickly at the Berlin blockade crisis. Is it true that the Cold War began after the Berlin blockade crisis of 1947, 1948? Well, first of all, you couldn't answer that question at all without defining what a Cold War is. What characteristics make a Cold War? What are the things that are important? And the thing with the theories is that they all have a slightly different perspective of what a Cold War is. And if you go into the dictionaries and the encyclopedias and the textbooks, IR textbooks, and you look up Cold War, there's about 4 or 5 different definitions of it. One definition of it is that it was a contest of ideology with the communists versus the free market democracies, battling it out to see which system was the superior system that the world should use. And that's a good one, and that's a liberal explanation that says that ultimately it was about democracy. You know, that democracy won the day. And that a Cold War would be about speeches. It would be about speeches about democracy and speeches about communism, like, for instance, the Truman Doctrine, where Truman gets up and says, any country in the world that is democracy and is threatened by communism, we will help out. You know? So it's a good guys versus bad guys thing. And liberalism would go a long way to explain it if you're using that definition. Another definition of it is that a Cold War is not a hot war. It seems to be some threshold that states are in a relationship of hostility towards each other, but nobody fires a single bullet. So you've got the characteristics of a war without slipping over into a hot war. There must be some sort of pivot that we're on where a Cold War becomes a hot war. But if you have that definition, you need a single point where you say it hasn't slipped over yet, but it's pretty close. Because if it's a state of hostility where not a shot's been fired, then how do you differentiate that from a period of peace where 2 states don't like each other, but they're not in a Cold War? You know? So when you're looking at the Berlin blockade crisis, what you're trying to find out is that pivot where the Cold War begins because of something that's going on, right? And if you're using a battle of ideology, then you could trace the beginning of the Cold War back to the bit where the ideology started to somehow enter an area of conflict. But when would that be? Would you say that it was because they didn't trust each other during the Second World War? That the ideology was already happening, even though they were allies? Would you say that it happened earlier than that, in 1917, when communism rose, and following up from the First World War, countries like Britain helped support the White Russians in the Civil War because they didn't want communism to succeed. So was it an ideological war before the Second World War? Was it an ideological war when they were allies during the Second World War? Was it an ideological war when Russia didn't get out of Iran and it was looking like it was going to make trouble in Greece over the Bosphorus? And we discovered that there were 10,000 soldiers buried in a forest in Capture. Was that when the Cold War started? You're trying to come to grips with that, and the theory that you use and the definition you use of Cold War will make your argument a good one or a bad one. So if you were a defensive realist, for instance, you would say that states seek security, that security manifested itself in terms of material resources, and that's why the Soviets moved into Central Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Europe in order to grab things that were resources. They might be resources in terms of more population for bigger armies. It might be resources in terms of steel and coal in order to make weapons. It might be resources that are strategic, like geography, having an air base here or troops positioned here would be more valuable than having them further back in Russia. It might be strategic in the sense that Napoleon and Hitler had both traveled across the North European plain very quickly because it's more or less flat. Poland is flat. You can get your army across there super fast, heading straight for Moscow within a matter of days. If you have your army projected forward into Central Europe, then you have a buffer zone that slows that transition of those armies across the North European plain. You're starting to think about the Soviet Union as being a very defensive, fearful, security conscious state that's doing things in its defense, doing things to make sure that it builds up its strength to be able to ward off what they see as a likely World War III from the democratic capitalist nations of the US in particular. You wouldn't actually say democratic national free trade because that would suggest it was slipping over into liberalism. Scratch that I said that. If you look at the US's actions in Western Europe after the Second World War, you see the same thing happening. During the First World War, after the war, the Americans get out, and then they find 20 years later that they've got another mess on their hands in Europe and they've got to go back in again. This time they say, well, forget it, we're not leaving. We're going to deploy our forces in Germany in particular, all along that buffer zone of the Soviets projected, forward projection. We're going to make sure that we don't give them another inch. We're thinking in zero-sum terms, that every inch that they get is an inch that we lose. Berlin's worth fighting for because we have this policy of containment, and if they get Berlin, that's another inch. You have a whole lot of things falling together there that say that a defensive realist would expect all of these things to happen, and a defensive realist is not in the least bit surprised when he sees NATO and the Warsaw Pact and collective security becoming the culminations of the Berlin blockade crisis. That the next step is to form cooperation in a military sense. So a defensive realist would be happy with that. A neo-realist would say that pretty much the same things without so much the emphasis on the cooperation. An offensive realist believes that states try to grow as big as they can because the biggest state is the safest state. So when you're pursuing security, you're pursuing as much power as you can get to make you the hegemon, either the hegemon in your region or the hegemon in the world. And the US was determined to be the hegemon in the Western world, and the USSR was determined to be the hegemon in the Eastern Bloc. So it's a slightly different spin on it, but the offensive realists would not be playing up the idea of collective security in NATO, and that they would say that those are just instruments of power, that the US actually wanted what it wanted, and it needed a whole lot of other states to fall into line by promising them that they would look after them. And the USSR did that beautifully by invading Czechoslovakia and invading Hungary and Poland a little bit later on, because for the same reason, it was all about about Russian interests, Russian hegemony, not really about a collection of states working together. So having a good definition that gives you an argument about not so much about ideology, but about why states would go into a Cold War conflict, trying to isolate that down to a point where it's at that tipping point where they slip into hostility without firing guns, kind of says that maybe the Berlin blockade might be that tipping point. When you can back that up with a whole lot of arguments about states seeking security and looking for material resources and having a zero-sum mentality that's the containment is, means that a realist explanation is pretty good on that. Of course, the same can be said of a liberal explanation or a constructivist explanation. But you can see here how the theory actually gives you a whole lot of steps you can go through in your argument that makes it a hell of a lot more convincing, because you're using some sort of a framework that you're saying, look, the framework is working, it's proving that these things did happen, and these are the things that the framework said would happen, right? That's what gets you an A or an A+ in your assignment, because nobody's going to argue with you. You're using your theory extremely well. You're showing them that you know how to use it, and you're not just giving me a historical narrative of this happened and this happened and this happened, but you're actually saying, well, these things happen for a reason. So I think that probably answers that question reasonably well. And to be honest with you, that's what the tutorial was about today. This week. We looked at the origins of the Cold War, and we went through pretty much the same reasoning. At least they did in my tutorial. I don't think we'll do that. So just looking at realism at a glance, this is a bit shaky, and you can tell it's shaky because my typography is so crappy. But we start with the fact that states are primary actors. They're unitary, they're rational, and what we mean by rational is that they have some sort of cost-benefit analysis, right? So states are the major players in the system. They think like people. They make decisions as a one unit, and they make rational decisions where they think they weigh up the good things and the bad things before they make them. The problem that they all face is that there's no world government, which we call anarchy. Therefore, there's nobody higher than the state that can tell states to get into line, ship up and shape out. If one state wants to be aggressive, we don't have a world government or a world police force like we do domestically, where if somebody decides they're going to go around robbing people, we have a police force that comes in and says, no, you can't rob people, you're going to jail. We don't have that at that higher level of the international system. We have anarchy, and therefore states are free to be aggressive if they so choose. They're free to be greedy. And this fear that states might be greedy, that states might impinge on our very survival, wipe us off the face of the earth, is relevant if you're Ukraine, or if you're Crimea, or if you're a number of countries that border aggressive states where they're living with that kind of fear all their lives. You know, a state like Finland was always fearful of Russia, always worried about it. The Baltic states. There's states in Southeast Asia like Vietnam who are afraid of China, Japan who are afraid of China. Lots and lots of examples of states that, Singapore was afraid of Malaysia, were very, very aware of that fear, that when it boils down to it, we could be gone tomorrow. And there are states like New Zealand where we don't have that fear and have never really had that fear. And to us, we just scratch our heads when people say, well, it's actually, we've got to think about ourselves first. And we say, well, why don't you cooperate with the rest of the world? And they say, well, because we're worried about ourselves. And we say, well, you've got to cooperate because that's the only way to get out of it. And they say, actually, to be perfectly frank with you, we're living with this fear all of our time. So states are uncertain of other states' intentions. They could be a friend today, but they might not be a friend in 10 years or 50 years' time. They could completely turn on us. So security is their number one goal, and therefore they look to self-help. And when we say self-help, we say that they prioritize their own concerns, and they look for material resources to build up their power. And those material resources might be things like coal or steel or copper or food or water or oil or gold, things that are material things that will give us the power to fund a large army. States never walk away and not have an army. Even the neutral states have got large armies or good armies, efficient armies. New Zealand's one of the few examples of a state that has a very, very lame army. But we also have a slight expectation, even though we don't have a very good military alliance with the US anymore, that the US would probably help us out if we got into desperate trouble. We feel they have a moral obligation if they don't have a real legal international law kind of obligation. So they start to think in terms, states start to think in terms of zero-sum thinking, which is that if I haven't got that material resource, they've got it, and if I've got it, they haven't got it. And okay, it's selfish or it's self-interested, but there's a real reason why they think that way. It's a real reason why China thinks the South China Sea is crucial to their defense, crucial to their prosperity. There's a real reason why Russia thought that Crimea was something that was worth taking a gamble on, because it was so important to their defense. I'm not going to go there. As Sean said before, there are differences between classical and structural realism. The reason why I've gone to such length to talk about structural or neo-realism is because classical is really hard to make a good case of in an essay, and it's better to keep away from it. I've mentioned the other types. Neoclassical realism is just I like it, I use it for my masters, but it's a really hard one to work with because you have to prove that states think in a certain way in terms of foreign policy, they have certain intentions. So you're looking for a whole different type of evidence from foreign policy documents, foreign policy statements, those sorts of things, which often if you don't have the language of that state like Chinese or Russian, really difficult to get that evidence. Liberalism, states are important, but so are individuals, NGOs, and multinational corporations. There's a kind of a good reason why liberals think that way. And it starts with individual human rights. Liberals believe that human rights are something that are worth fighting for, and that if individuals have them, that states ought to have them too, and should protect their rights and the rights of states whose rights have been taken away from them. So if an authoritarian regime locks people in prison without a trial, then they're effectively at war with their own citizens, and the Liberals believe that it's a good war to go in and free those citizens from the authoritarian regime. Liberals also believe that in anarchy for the most part, but they say that states can socialize anarchy out. They don't need to live in fear. They can find ways to cooperate with each other. And a lasting peace is achievable when states cooperate. They talk about the harmony of interests, that all states have interests that they share and that they should discuss those rather than be hung up on their own self-interests. Very important that regimes, there are good regimes and there are bad regimes. And liberalism, the idea of good and evil is something real. You'll find Robert is very quick to say that Russians are a bad regime and that they don't deserve to be around. Whereas the realists won't focus on that. They'll say we can explain why the Russians are behaving the way that they do, because not because of their regime type, but because Russians' security interests are at stake here. Liberals are also interested in rules. States need rules because some states are tempted, because of anarchy, they're tempted to cheat, find ways around rules or dismiss rules entirely. So rules bind states to behave in a good way. And that trade helps peace. And I can't see what my other one is, but you have to think, I don't know what it is. Oh, I know, it's absolute gains. So states believe that if we all work together, you can get rid of the zero-sum thinking. A win-win situation for everybody. If we build a house together, we can build a house much faster, and then I go and build your house, and then we'll go down the road and build the other guy's house. And it's a hell of a lot better than me just trying to build my house alone and you try to build your house alone. So the cooperation leads to better, more gains than just gains that we pursue individually. Okay, constructivism. Constructivism is not a theory that competes at the same level that the liberals and the realists do. It's kind of adding another layer above liberals and realists. And so often constructivists don't necessarily have a problem with an explanation that a realist or liberal comes up with, but they say, yeah, but I want to add another dimension to it, which is usually around the idea of identity. The world is socially constructed. There's a lot of abstract ideas in the world that we fervently believe in, that motivate us. We believe in the idea of marriage, for the most part, that marriage is an obligation, that two people have a commitment to each other, that creates an area of cooperation where which binds society together. It's the first unit of society. And we believe in property, the idea that you can own a piece of land that can be yours, that you have the rights to it. It doesn't exist in nature, it only exists in the human mind, but it's an extremely powerful concept that we should tell people to get off our land, or tell people that they don't have any right to my food because it's my food and I've grown it. And that's a socially constructed concept. Identities are intersubjective and change. So if I think that I'm a good person, but I act in a bad way, I can go on thinking that I'm a good person. But if you tell me I'm a bad person and point out the things that I've done that are bad and are persuasive, I'll change my identity. I'll say, you're right, I'm not a good person. All these years I thought that I was doing the right thing. You pointed out to me through intersubjectivity that I'm not the person I think I am, right? So maybe I need to become more good, or maybe I just accept I'm a bad person and I can live with that. You know, I've got faults. We've all got faults. I do shitty things from time to time. You know, tough luck. If you're dumb enough to put up with it, that's your problem. So identity in states is very similar. If you think about the US identity, a lot of US behavior in the world system is based around the idea that the US is the shining light on the hill, that it's the champion of democracy, that it's a state that other states ought to emulate. We have a lifestyle, we have values, we have norms that are all important things that shape our identity. And you can see why we behave the way we do, why we go into Iraq to liberate Iraq, because it's our identity that we are the good guys that go and do those things. And all states have identities. New Zealand has a very strong identity of itself as a small state, as a champion of other states that does moral things, that we're multilateral, that we cooperate, that we're good guys, you know, that we're the first to do lots of things. We have an identity and that shapes our behavior as well. So we make choices based on ideas, values, norms, culture, and history. And those are things that shape identity, but they're also things that you can look at individually. So you could say that China in the South Seas is there because China believes it has an historical rights to the South China Seas, and it's behaving according to what it believes the history is. You can say that China believes it's a peaceful nation, that it doesn't invade other nations, that it doesn't have a history or a culture of being aggressive, and that therefore our rise shouldn't threaten other nations because it will be a peaceful rise, which is what the Chinese often say. The constructivists often believe that the system is anarchic, or agree that the system is anarchic, but they say that anarchy is another socially constructed concept and it can change and it can be shaped. So there are many countries that have given up their sovereignty or aspects of their sovereignty, parts of their sovereignty, because they see the benefit of that. You know, the Schengen zone, I should say, in Europe means that states were prepared to give away the policing of their borders, in certain states anyway, because, which is a key aspect of sovereignty, because they saw the benefit of a Europe where free travel was more or less the norm. You can say that too, that a state that gives up its ability to defend itself, like New Zealand, on the basis that the other states will help defend it, are giving up a key aspect of their sovereignty. One of the arguments that the constructivists say is that states have views of friends and enemies. They say that it's okay for Britain to build up a nuclear weapons arsenal because they're a friend and they'd never use it. But North Korea is an enemy and they shouldn't be building up their nuclear arsenal because they might use it against us. So for some reason, our views of friends and enemies seem to have something to do with our views of anarchy. So states' interests are shaped by identity, or another way of looking at that is that states, if you know the identity of a state and you know what its interests are, you'll know how it will behave. So if you know that the US considers itself to be the good guys, the good cop that goes around putting out fires around the world and making the world a safer place for democracy, then you're not surprised if its interests in the Middle East are that the Middle East ought to be a place that they can trade with and get oil from, and that their interests of the Middle East are that the people are being brutally attacked by their dictators, that the American identity will motivate them to go into Iraq in 2003 and try to liberate it from Saddam Hussein. There are ideas called discourses in constructivism, which I probably make too much out of. But a discourse is an idea that gets entrenched over time. And one of the best examples would be that women are the weaker sex. You know, because we don't believe that today, but for a long time it was a discourse that held true. And you can look back through history and you can see that argument being repeated endlessly in books and plays and music and movies a little bit later on. So it becomes an entrenched idea and it becomes a discourse. So there are discourses about all sorts of things. There are discourses about collective security. There are discourses about China being a highly irrational state that likes to get excited and throw insults around. And those are the things that shape the way people see each other about over a long period of time. Okay, I think I'll skip the rest of that. I think I'll skip that. So ending this, the best thing I can say to you is to understand the theories, because you're getting a lot more out of your argument than you would be if you were just giving me a narrative of, I think the Cold War happened at such and such a time because there was mistrust, you know, and mistrust, I think, explains why the Cold War happened. You know, it just seems a bit light-headed, lightweight to be using narratives like that without the theory. You're going to need to memorize the theory like you memorized your times table, because when you get into exam, very often you'll find that there's a question that you don't know the answer to because you haven't studied it. And just by sheer force of the fact that the other exam questions are so awful, you think, oh, I just got to have a go at this one. It doesn't happen very often. It happens in Robert's courses, but it might happen in another one. And the wonderful thing about the theory is you can pull it out and you can start to put together an essay based on what the theory expects to happen. So, you know, the one that I about this sometimes, you can build up, without very much evidence, you can build up quite a good convincing essay on why China is involved in the South China Seas based on your theory and not an awful lot of facts, because you don't know enough about Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, the Vietnamese oil rig situation, what the 9-dash line is, what the history of the 9-dash line is, and all that sort of stuff. You haven't studied that, but you still got a pretty good essay out of the basic precepts of a neo-realist argument. So last piece of advice is, now that we've done this, I would get started on your essays. Get them done now, because it's much more relaxing to sit down, spend a couple of hours getting your definitions together and a basic layout of the argument than it is to wait to the last minute and not really have any time to just sit there, park it, come back to it a day later and say, is this all making sense now? If you rush it at the last minute, we will sense it immediately and you'll get a poorer mark for it. So always start with the definitions, because if you've got, you know, a paragraph or two down on paper, you're starting to feel good about the essay. You're starting to feel more relaxed about what you're doing. I think that's all I've got. It is all I've got. I don't think I'll do the second tutorial now, because I've covered quite a lot about that in the Berlin blockade. But you're very welcome to contact me if you want to know more about that question. I'm happy to read drafts. I'm not allowed to give you comments on a finished draft. If I look at it and I say, this is the finished essay, then you'll get very vague answer out of me. Something along the lines of looks good and probably not much else. And even then I might be overcommitting, because if I say it looks good and your tutor thinks it's rubbish, then you're going to come back screaming at me, telling me that you thought it was really good. And look, I only got a B+. However, if you give me an early draft, I can help you. I can say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Or here's a good place where you can get your definition from. Here's a place where you can get some extra information on that. And so give me something which is sort of half written. You'll feel better about the fact you've got some good comments out of it and some helpful, hopefully, advice. And I can actually help you construct something that's really going to get a good mark. So, any questions before we leave? So we're leaving. I'm going to try and do this on a regular basis. I'll send out a broadcast email. Lynn, are you okay?
Yeah, all good.
Good, okay. You come and talk to me if you want to about your essay.
Okay.
I'm around all the time. Okay, we'll talk to everybody
Thank
else.
you very much.
Cheers, Peter.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Cheers.